Hey there everyone. So I just completed Finnegans Wake. This is one of my most pleasing literary accomplishments, and I guess you really could call it an accomplishment with this work. And I've covered this work to varying extents on this channel, but I was deciding to wait to do something extremely substantive until I finished the work as a whole, so I could really give some more detailed thoughts. And initially I was thinking, well, let's go through all my reading notes for this book, go through all the big passages, give like a 2, 3, 4 hour video just for those who need some Finnegans Wake content on the internet, because it is lacking in many regards. There's of course reading groups that you can get into, which are kind of not necessarily ubiquitous. But other than that, it's kind of hard to find ways to close read Finnegans Wake without just like resorting to secondary literature necessarily, which is good, by the way. But as I was going through the Wake, I was realizing that I think it would be much more beneficial to make some content geared at those who are reading Finnegans Wake for the first time. Because I think if there has ever been a book that there needs to be a guide for just understanding how to read, it is Finnegans Wake. And after completing it one time, I can tell you that it will not be my first time, but it was certainly fruitful and exciting. I'm glad I'm done for now, because as you'll see when I show you my copy, it has been annotated extremely heavily, and it took a lot of time and effort. But now that I've done that, I feel prepared enough to at least give you some thoughts for someone who's just read it for the first time, such that if you've heard about this book, about it being the hardest book in the Western canon, you can maybe see why that's true, but maybe also why it's enjoyable. So in this lecture, I've got 7 different points that I want to cover. First, I'm going to give an overview of some different editions of Finnegans Wake, kind of the considerations you should keep in mind, as well as some secondary literature I used throughout my reading. I won't be showing all the secondary literature I own on Finnegans Wake, just that I've read, which by the time I'd finished this book, I got so enraptured in it that I couldn't devote my time to secondary literature like I wanted. And then secondly, I'll talk about why Finnegans Wake is a special book, in what way it is a different reading experience from your average book, and how you should alter your expectations a little before reading it. And then I want to give a general summary of some of the themes and characters. I've done this in my first lecture on my Finnegans Wake for Fools series, which, by the way, it was intended to be maybe 40 lectures long, but it only ended up being 7. And then fourthly, I want to give an actual secondary literature review. Not super substantive, but just enough to give you some of the different thoughts for the secondary literature that's out there, so you can see what you like. Then I'm going to give my thoughts about the Wake, just candidly, after completion. Then I'm going to give you my reading tips and timetable, as well as annotation techniques, which I think are really important for this book. And then finally, why you should read Finnegans Wake. Now, for my reading of Finnegans Wake, I chose to read from this most ubiquitous edition, the Penguin Modern Classics edition. And I was a little bit hesitant because I've heard that there are many errors within the text, which is kind of part and parcel for Joyce, because he was such a control freak, per se, when it comes to the editing and producing of his text. But I'm actually quite happy that I used this edition. For one, it is the biggest paperback edition that I know of in terms of the ones that I have laid my hands on, and I think that's actually really important, because you need a page big enough with margins big enough to annotate this work. And if we look at, for example, the Centennial edition of Finnegans Wake, also published by Penguin, this is my favorite in terms of just the looks. Also, it's very pliable, malleable, which I really like in a book. But the actual size of the book is a decent bit smaller. And along with that means smaller text and smaller margins. And when I was deciding just, okay, I gotta pull the plug on one of these and decide which one I'm gonna read, and I was like, man, the text just seems just a little small. Not small for reading. I have no problem like on an eyesight level. But thinking about when I was gonna read it and annotate it, I was like, I don't know if I can do that edition. And then I also have the Wordsworth Classics edition. I had actually ordered this with a different cover image, but they gave me a different one, which is interesting. This one is nice, very similar to the Penguin one, except, and this is potentially something that could make you buy it, is it has line numbers. The Penguin edition does not have line numbers, and that is my biggest gripe. Why didn't they put line numbers on Finnegans Wake? Now, I get that the page numbers are the same in all of the major editions, 628. All of these, by the way, have 628 pages, which is 3.14 times 2, 314 times 2, is 628. So kind of a cool little fact about the book. But all of these have the same page numbers, so it's not necessarily a difficulty, but I mean, line numbers are just so key when you're going through this text. And there are line numbers on this text, but they're right next to the spine. You can't even see the whole number, really, so I don't know if it would be useful, but if you just need all the help you can get when it comes to citing Finnegans Wake, then maybe the Wordsworth Classics is for you. The construction is good. The print doesn't smear with your thumb. I hate when books do that. But that's just some thought on some of the different editions of Finnegans Wake. And then when it comes to secondary literature, the most useful book that I found was Bill Cole Clyatt's River Run to Livy. This is on the first page of Finnegans Wake. It's about 300 pages, and about 2/3 of the text is literally just going sentence by sentence, word by word, giving you the different scholarly perspectives on the Wake. Bill Cole Clyatt himself is not a scholar. I think he was actually an elementary school teacher. But he uses that non-scholarly perspective to give you some more ease of mind as you are going through the Wake. So in addition to kind of framing the text with a lot of Joyce's personal remarks through letters and things like that, you also get that sentence-by-sentence summary of all the different stuff on the first page, and then you get a chapter summary for every chapter in the Wake towards the end. So this is a really good book. I'll be coming back to this to a decent extent in the secondary literature review. Then we have Joseph Campbell's Skeleton Key to Finnegans Wake. This was the first of its kind to come out, and it's quite interesting. It's definitely trying to present a unified narrative for what Finnegans Wake is about, in terms of the universality of the hero archetype and things like that. I'm not as privy to that viewpoint philosophically in terms of the universality of archetypes necessarily. I think they are a bit of just an invented, our stories tend to fall in line with these things, so let's just blow it out of proportion and say it's like some big secret of the universe. But nevertheless, there are some interesting remarks in the Skeleton Key. And then I have two different annotated copies which I used. I have Roland McHugh's Guide to Finnegans Wake, or Annotated Guide to Finnegans Wake. This is awesome. You must have it if you're going to read Finnegans Wake. Like, must have it. First off, it's beautiful in paperback. Very soft cover. But when you look inside this annotated copy, you will see that it has a word-by-word annotation of the entirety of Finnegans Wake, such that the spatial location on the page of the annotation is the same as that word in the physical copy of Finnegans Wake. So you can lay this out next to your copy of Finnegans Wake, or I laid my book, like had it open like this and put my book open on top of it, and I would just slide it to the side when I needed to look at something. And you can literally just go word by word and figure out all the different, this is kind of a collation of lots of different scholarly discoveries regarding Finnegans Wake. And it's very cool. It's going to give you the most help when it comes to understanding all the allusions and whatnot, and the puns and things like that. But for a first reading, try it out for the first 29 pages, the first chapter. See what you think about it. But I found, I did it for about the first 100 pages, following along exactly with the annotated guide. And I found myself getting bogged down. It was just too much. And not necessarily too much insofar as I couldn't have gone through the book like that. I could. But one, it would have taken me a lot longer. And two, it interrupted the flow of reading Finnegans Wake. And for a first reading, you're not going to be able to achieve that perfect flow. You're trying to get used to Joyce's wordplay, his reinvention of language, his kind of understanding of plot and characters. So you're not going to get a full, just nice flow progression through the work. But this just chopped it up way too much. I mean, I was going word by word to the extent where I wasn't being able to feel the rhythm that connects those words together, the dynamism that runs through Finnegans Wake. So I ended up spending the majority of the work with O'Hare and Dillon's A Classical Lexicon for Finnegans Wake. I have no idea how common this book is. It came with a dust jacket, but I took it off because I hate dust jackets. I got it for like $80. This was my most appreciated purchase for Finnegans Wake, probably, because it just has Latin and Greek in it, and it has it laid out with line number references and page number references in a very useful way, where it gave me enough information where the Latin and the Greek, which I was just totally lost on being able to intuit necessarily, I would have this to kind of help keep me anchored to some of those meanings, so I wasn't just flying by all the references. And when I used this classical lexicon, I actually found myself being able to engage with the Wake and figure out the puns for myself and have that enjoyable experience of figuring out the Wake. And I'll talk more about that as we get into that. But I think it's a good justification to say that for the first read, maybe don't use the McHugh guide, at least for a one-to-one correspondence for the text. What I ended up doing is, as I would go through the text, I would sort of note if there was a page that I wanted to go back to in the McHugh guide and just run over it after I'd annotated the page so that I'm not just relying on McHugh. And I found that to be much more fruitful. Now, Finnegans Wake has a lot of mystique around it. It is a very elusive and elusive and interesting book. And there's never been anything written like it. As such, we don't really have a plan set in place already for how we can read this work. Most of our other works of literature, we sort of understand how character development works, how themes work, the sort of plot devices for the climax, and then all the other aspects of our plot we have. And even when it comes to language, we have, very standard kind of notions of semantics and grammaticality. But those are kind of thrown out the window in Finnegans Wake. or at least not thrown out the window, but called into question and turned into a problematic. And when you read Finnegans Wake, Joyce is celebrating the diversity of language. He is celebrating the inherent multiplicity in every single word, such that Finnegans Wake betrays any one interpretation. And this is perhaps its greatest strength, is that it is unassimilable. It is not a work which is tied down by scholarship in a serious sense. This is why I'm not privy to those who say that Joyce never wanted people to do scholarship on his works, especially Finnegans Wake. I don't think that's true. I think Joyce knew that this was going to be filled with so many allusions and techniques that people would want to study it, and that could be a helpful way of understanding the text. But I think Joyce was consoled by the fact that that was not going to be enough. That Finnegans Wake would always be left over after it has been completely absorbed by scholarship, or by sort of line by line, word by word, letter by letter analysis. So when you read Finnegans Wake, it's important to note that not only is that sort of line by line, fragment by fragment analysis useful, but you also need to understand that this text thrives on style. If there was a reward for most ingenuity and style, Finnegans Wake would doubtless win that. Many people who hate the Wake would say, yeah, it would probably win in that regard. Because what Finnegans Wake does is it combines the rhythm of everyday speech, which we don't think about, with poetry, and puts it into prose. And it segments that prose in very weird ways where, for example, we have that really weird looking chapter where suddenly we're like in a school book and there's all these marginal annotations. It's around page 280 and the text is very small and there's a bunch of footnotes. This is a stylistic, formal, inventive quality of the text, which is meant to alter our perception and way we interact with language. And what Joyce tries to do when he uses language is he relies on wordplay, puns, portmanteau words, and the inherent variety of associations in every word. He will make it where a word is, for example, spelled very similarly to another word. A very common example is the German Walpurgisnacht. That will sort of be spelled in English with some variety, such that you can figure out, oh, that sounds a lot like Walpurgisnacht. And then that helps you make sense of the passage when you realize that. So Joyce will do these cross-linguistic puns and word plays in a way that brings to mind the fact that, for example, even when we speak English, we are tacitly referencing to Spanish, French, Italian, Latin, Greek, German, Dutch, Anglo-Saxon, etc. And Joyce is going to pack like 40 languages into this book. Like, it's some sort of crazy figure. Joyce knew so many languages. He was fluent in, of course, English, but also French and Italian. He also knew Latin from a very young age with his schooling that he was in. Clongo's school was a Jesuit school, I believe, that he was attending for some time. And in Finnegans Wake, he's also making us think about the way in which words link up to songs, link up to historical events, link up to historical monuments or historic events. Bringing all of these together and making it a little bit of a puzzle into the collective unconscious. There's a sort of tacit recognition, I think, of Carl Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. of this idea that language is basically a cesspool of collective relations of different people's consciousness together, such that we get this collective vision for our expectations for what language ought to mean, the associations inherent in language. I think of, for example, etymologies of words, which Joyce is going to play on a lot. All of this creates a reading experience that betrays the usual flow of language. It's segmented in a way where when you read it, you have to adjust the way you approach each individual word, and you be on the lookout for, even if I'm getting just a hint that this word might mean something else than what it appears, I may be right. And when you read Finnegans Wake, if you just indulge that part of your mind that has suspicions, you will stumble upon very interesting ideas, concepts, plot points, word plays. It hinges on your ability to be creative and to be an individual thinker when it comes to reading the Wake. And I think that is very exciting, because when that happens, suddenly there becomes a very explicit link and recognition of the reader and the author as one, as engaged in a common linguistic project which goes beyond English, for example. The language of Finnegans Wake has been called by scholars Wakeese, right? You've got Chinese, you've got Cantonese, you've got Wakeese. And in Wakeese, it's still English, but it approaches English as something which should be shattered into 1,001 nights, so to speak, to reference the great work of art. And by doing so, by breaking it off into 1,001 pieces, we get all of the different associations inherent in language, and most specifically, we shift our focus of language from semantics, which is to say meaning, to the sonority of language, the sonic qualities, the bare materiality of words, of the creation of words in our mouth, in our mind, right, in our mind's ear, our aural capacities to use language. And for language to be understood as a very active process which requires every single bit of our conscious attention. And that's something key to understanding reading the Wake, is that when you pick up this work, you must devote your attention fully to it. The ability to comprehend the Wake, most importantly, depends on viewing it as what Wagner calls a Gesamtkunstwerk. Wagner envisioned his operas as a Gesamtkunstwerk, which is to say a grand artwork, which would combine drama, poetry, symphonic music, opera, acting, put all of these together, fundamentally change our conception of opera and music and song and poetry in a way where all of these were part of a synchronous project. And in Finnegans Wake, we have a bunch of different elements, similar to Wagner, which are combined in this univocal project. We have the spelling of words. We have the visible appearance of words on the page. We have the spatial layout of where a word is located on the page, and if it is interrupted, for example, if it is multiple syllables, by a dash, signaling to the next line, which often breaks up a word such that you see the hidden associations that you wouldn't have if it wasn't segmented like that. You also have the aural capacity of humans to conceptualize language. You also have the physiological feeling of creating the language in your mouth. And finally, you have the sonic capacity of what it sounds like on an aesthetic level. All of these must be viewed simultaneously, and all are equiprimordial to Joyce's project. With any Gesamtkunstwerk, you can't take any piece of the cake on its own or remove any. This would be like listening to the Ring Cycle by Wagner without the opera, or without the orchestra, or without the stage, or without poetry. Say it wasn't written like that. It wouldn't work. So in the same way, when you're reading Finnegans Wake, you have to have all the pieces of cake simultaneously. It's best just not even to cut the cake. You just have to eat it whole. And that's an overwhelming project, but maybe something that you might enjoy as you get into it. Oh, my most dreaded part, giving you a general summary of the themes and characters. And themes and characters are so interlinked together that they might as well be one and the same. They represent a synchronous aspect of this archetypal message that Joyce is trying to bring us. We have two main characters, a guy and a girl. The guy is Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, or HCE. And HCE is more important because Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker just happens to be the name that is most associated with him, but it is by no means his only name. All the time throughout Finnegans Wake you will have peppered HCE, ECH, ECH, HEC. All of his initials will be figured throughout here, such that you will have him peppered throughout the page in implicit ways. And this male character, Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, has committed a crime of some kind. We're not exactly sure what it is, but it occurred in Phoenix Park. It seems to have happened near, on, or inside the magazine wall in Phoenix Park in Dublin. And all of Joyce's works are about Dublin. They all focus around Dublin, and Joyce just brings out the universality of Dublin as a city by looking at HCE, who is represented by everything masculine, everything that rises, everything that is phallic, indeed. So, even on the first page, Howth Castle and environs. Howth Castle is on a peninsula in Dublin. A peninsula juts out into the sea like a phallic appendage. Howth Castle is erect like a phallic appendage. So HCE is this phallic yet obstinate entity. He sits there like a mountain or a hill, and he's unchanging in a sense. He is rippled down through history in all of the great hero characters. He is Finn McCool, the ancient Irish giant hero who supposedly rules over Ireland for like 200 years or something like that. He is Tim Finnegan from the song Finnegans Wake, who is drunk, is a bricklayer, falls from a ladder, breaks his skull. His friends carry him to a wake, which is a funeral, and they start crying, but then they start having fun. Then they start fighting and throwing alcohol, some of which spills on Tim Finnegans. He rises, resurrects, and basically just tells them, "Did you think I was dead? Just keep going." And then Finnegans Wake continues. So it's also Tim Finnegan, of course. HCE is also Sir Tristram. He is also Tristan from Tristan und Isolde by Wagner. He's all of these. I mean, he's the Duke of Wellington. He's all of these heroic characters. And indeed, he is the hero inside each of us. He is that obstinate, self-willing Übermensch, which has the ability to make decisions and assert one's individuality, one's singular nature apart from everything else, one's ability to spite the universe, in a sense, and rise up with the sword daunting, as Stephen Dedalus does in Ulysses, although only euphemistically, where daunting is actually his ash plant, his wooden staff. So HCE has committed some kind of crime, and we are hinted to its nature, and I think Anthony Burgess has the best theory on this, which is that HCE has potentially committed incest in real life. Now, when I say real life, it is commonly acknowledged that Finnegans Wake is a dream. Joyce called it his book of the dark, his night book. And we're trying to replicate the way ideas are associated with each other in a dream. So it's very kind of all pell-mell sometimes. But in this case, there are so many references to insects that Burgess notes that incest and insect are spelled the same way, just with the S and the C reversed, right? You just switch them around and you get incest or insect. And of course, Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker is commonly changed to earwig in Finnegans Wake. And there's the story of the ant and the grasshopper and all these other bugs that feature throughout Finnegans Wake. And this represents kind of the low of HCE's subconscious, which is probably linked to either his actions with his daughter Isabel or Izzy, which were incestuous, or his intentions to do so. In Finnegans Wake, we're sort of journeying into the human unconscious, and I say the human because it's unclear whose dream we're in. There is one reference that, in fact, this dream may be the dream of the two girls who HCE supposedly committed his crime with in Phoenix Park. And we don't really know who these two girls are, but word gets out about HCE's crime, or at least word starts spreading that HCE made a crime. There is some indication that maybe he never even made the crime, that maybe he is innocent, or maybe he only made some sort of superficial thought crime that he's trying to deal with. And word gets out, it spreads all the time, and turns into the Ballad of Percy O'Reilly, which is HCE's sort of persona when he has become branded as a criminal. It is the part of himself which he sees as a criminal. And in this way, one of the main themes of Finnegans Wake is struggling with guilt and struggling with being fallen. And Joyce uses the idea of fallen in many senses. You have fallen in the Christian sense of Adam and Eve were born into the Garden of Eden by the artificing of God from clay, and they have everything they need, but they're told not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They do, by being tempted by a serpent, and then they fall as a result. They are cast out of the Garden of Eden, and the curse of this fallen nature, which is sin, which is disobeying God, is reverberated down through all human history. That's the Christian idea of the fall. But you also have, for example, Tim Finnegan's fall from the ladder from Finnegans Wake. You also have the fall of Humpty Dumpty from the wall. And the little kind of nursery rhyme song of Humpty Dumpty's gets kind of riffed on throughout Finnegans Wake. You'll see all the king's soldiers and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. You'll see that kind of in fragments throughout, and often spelled differently. This can also just be the fall from grace, in whatever sense that may mean. The fall from one's expectations of oneself, one's ideals. And in a sense, Finnegans Wake is always conscious of the fact that HCE is an ideal. as other characters are. He's a little snippet of what's all inside of us, but he's an abstraction. He's used to tell a story, but the point of Finnegans Wake is to remind us that Finnegans, which is to say average, everyday people, wake. So the title of Finnegans Wake, which is just packed full of so much meaning, can almost be a factual statement. Finnegans do in fact wake. It's reminding you that this is just a dream and that this wakes up and you have to go back to your everyday life and you have to actually do things. So you can learn what you can from these ideal narratives, but there are many passages in Finnegans Wake that explicate that this is just an ideal. It's just meant to tell you something about yourself and how people deal with guilt of being fallen in whatever way that may be. It's also about sex and relationships. Because along with HCE, we have the female character, ALP, Anna Livia Pluribel. And Anna, meaning river in Irish or Gaelic, Livia as a reference to the river Liffey, which goes through Dublin, starts from the mountains, goes down, empties out into the Dublin Bay. And then Pluribel, hinting at the plurality, the multiplicity inherent in this character. And ALP represents something very different from HCE's obstinate, heroic, phallic nature. She is ubiquitous. She is ever-changing. She is dynamic. She has everything that gives life. I mean, think about in the very real sense of women birthing babies. That is giving life. And in Finnegans Wake, she represents this sort of divine feminine energy, in a sense. She is what propels Joyce's narrative forward. And it's important to mention that this plays into one of the feminist messages of Finnegans Wake. If you look at the first page, River Run Past Eve and Adams. We start not with Adam and Eve, but Eve and Adam. Eve is first. Eve wasn't made first. You could say, oh, Eve sinned first, so maybe he's trying to reframe this to be about sin, not about kind of birth order as if it was some sort of genealogy. But I think it's very clear that Joyce is concerned the most with ALP. When you get to the fourth part of Finnegans Wake, the Recurso, you realize that this book has been about ALP the whole time. It's been about how does mankind, but also in this case the man, HCE, recover from his feelings of guilt only by the aid of ALP. She stands by him the whole time, and she has written, for example, a letter which she claims will absolve HCE of his supposed crime. And HCE is going to get put on trial by 4 judges and a jury of 12. The 4 judges can be a reference to, for example, the 4 chapters of the work. It can also be the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It can also be, the 4 sides of a square. It could be, many things. And the 12 can, of course, be a reference to the 12 apostles. Lots of biblical references in Finnegans Wake, by the way. But ALP sticks beside HCE the whole time. She acts as not his rock, because she's not obstinate, but rather she is able to ebb and flow and meet HCE where he is at. And in this way, ALP is a mirror image of Nora Barnacle, James Joyce's wife, who, by all accounts, was a fantastic woman. She willfully followed James Joyce to his some 100 plus homes throughout his life, visiting and living in various cities, teaching sometimes at, for example, the Berlitz School, writing reviews or books, and learning languages. which Nora was not very good at. And there's some references in Finnegans Wake to that struggle of some feminine character to learn languages, which is doubtless a reference to Nora. But Nora stood beside Joyce the whole time. She didn't always understand his writing per se. She makes this explicit. But, for example, once Finnegans Wake was published, she said, I don't know what everyone is doing just focusing on Ulysses. Finnegans Wake is where it's really at. And even though she admits that she doesn't really particularly like or love Finnegans Wake, she may not have really loved Ulysses, considering that Joyce gave her a first edition, possibly the first ever printed edition of Ulysses, and she sold it. But nevertheless, she stuck by him. She understood his artistic zeal, and she followed him from swerve of shore to bend of bay, as we see on the first page, accompanying this male figure. And with her comes the idea of cyclical history. One of the key thematic and conceptual heroes of Finnegans Wake is Giambattista Vico, who was an Italian philosopher and perhaps the first philosopher of history. He was the first one to kind of make an explicit problematic out of philosophizing history itself. History as a philosophical discipline of some kind. And he had a four-stage view of history, which was cyclical. You have the theocratic age, which is believing in gods. Then you have the aristocratic age, where we believe in kings. Then you have the democratic age, where we believe in mankind. And then we have a fourth stage, which is the recurso. It is a short, chaotic upheaval, which is signaled by thunder, by a thunderclap, which signals that we are going to return to the theocratic age. So Vico says that as man is trying to build civilization, he first resorts to gods and comes to rely on God to explain things. And then as we create societies, now kings are sort of structuring authority for how we understand the world. And then we have the democratic age, where it's the age of enlightenment values, of reason, of the human will, of rationality, all of these things. And then we have a sort of chaotic age, which it seems like everyone who says something about Vico is saying that the chaotic age is right now. Look at everything that's happening. As if people haven't been saying that for thousands of freaking years. But in the recurso, it's short, signaled by the thunderclap of the gods or God, which signals a return. And this, of course, links to Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return, which I would suggest knowing some things about Nietzsche. It's not necessarily key to understanding Finnegans Wake. It is not going to be your skeleton key if you just know Nietzsche's entire oeuvre, but it certainly helps to know some things about Nietzsche, because Joyce was very influenced by Nietzsche and Wagner. But nevertheless, ALP represents this cyclical aspect of history. And we get a little hint as to the cyclical nature of Finnegans Wake on page 452. He says, "From our no-story house upon this Benedictine errand, but it is historically the most glorious mission, secret or profound, through all the annals of our, as you so often term her, ever fresh painted Livy, in beatific repose upon the silence of the dead, from Pharaoh the next first down to Rameshekel's the last bust thing. The Vico road goes round and round to meet where terms begin. Still unappealed to by the cycles and unappalled by the recourses we feel, all serene, never you fret, as regards our dutiful cask." So there's an explicit reference here to Vico and to this round and round cycle. And indeed, recourses is the recurso that I spoke of. And in such a situation, we also have a reference to our no-story house. In a sense, there is no story to Finnegans Wake. The plot it's virtual, right? It's existing in a dream, so it's a sort of liminal state. It's not necessarily a current events in the waking world. It's the mysterious ideas of someone who is asleep. So in a sense, there is no story to Finnegans Wake insofar as it is an apparition, a chimera, a paradox, which it is our job to figure out how we can understand. Joyce is trying to explain a lot of paradoxes here. But this cyclical aspect of history, and indeed of humanity, is embodied in ALP. And together, HCE and ALP are a synchronicity. When acting together, we have the most beautiful and exciting parts of the text, where they come together, where Joyce shows his sentimentality over her, for example. And I want to give us a really beautiful example of this union of this masculine and feminine energy together that Joyce really embodies. And this is really beautiful for understanding the sound of Finnegans Wake, but also, indeed, that feeling of sentimentality that hints at the semi-autobiographical nature of Finnegans Wake. Well, how dire do these hours when thy like fades. All's dull and yellow, and it is bedurn that thou art of passing hence, mein Bruder. Abel Sean, with the twisting of the robe, ere the morning of light calms our hardest throes beyond Cod's cradle and Porpoise plain. From carnal relations unfamiliar faces to the inns of Tuskland, where the elephants scrum from Oro till the ousts of miracles, where the tall stories grow proudest. More's the pity, but for all your deeds of goodness, you were so oft and forever doing, mano mano and miria miria, ever to mully mully, as our humbler classes, whose virtue is humility, can tell. It is hardly we in the country of the old, Sean Moy, can part you for, Ollie Paul. You were the walking saint, you were tooth there, the grace of gods and pities in the solace of the wake. Countenance whose disparition afflictedly fond Fuin feels. Winner of the gamings, primed at the studiants, pro-predicted of the storyboats, the choice of ages wise. Spick-spook spokesman of our spectresque silentiousness. Musha, be minded of us out there in cockpit, poor 12 o'clock scholars, some time or other any when ye think the time. Wisha, be coming back to us way home in Biddy House, one way or either anywhere, we miss your smile. Palm wine, breadfruit, sweet milk soup. Sausupo. However, our people here and Samonesia will not be after forgetting you, and the elders looking and marking the journeys, chalking up drizzle in, drizzle out on the four-bare mats. How you would be thinking in your thoughts, how the deepings did it all begin, and how you would be scrimmaging through your scruples to collar a hold of an imperfection being committed. Sireland calls you, Mary Loy is sailing moonlike, and slyly Momarines lady maid at Gladhouse Lodge. Turn your coat, strong character, and tarry among us down the vale, young Ander, only once more. And may the moss of preposterousness gather your rolling home. May foggy dews be dyes your hoop rings. May the fire plug of filiality reinsure your bunghole. May the barley lend behind glow luck to your bathershins, till well we know you were loth to leave us, winding your hobble de horn, right royal post, but, arrah sure, pulse of our slumber, dream book page, by the grace of Votre Dame, when the natural morning of your nocturne blank merges into the national morning of golden sun-up, and Don Leary gets his own back from old grog gorgeous Quartos, as that good ship, the Johnny Joys,
takes the wind from waterlogged Erin's king, you will shift across the moorland sea and round up in your own escapology some canonizator's day or other, sack on back, alack, digging snow. Not so? Like the good man you are, with your picture pockets turned knock-side out in the rake of the rain for fresh remittances, and from that till in this case, timeless tenant, may the tussocks grow quickly under your tram thickets, and the daisies trip lightly over your battered crops. So, right, Joyce has this intense viviality in his writing. It's very fulfilling to read and just to hear and to experience. Even if you didn't understand what he was saying, if you relinquish your need to feel like you have to understand every single thing about Finnegans Wake, every little detail, every meaning, every allusion, suddenly it opens up like a Lichtung, a field, a clearing, as Heidegger says. And in such a case, you are able to access Joyce as an experience, as an affect, as something which is uniquely blended into all of these characters and themes in a way that is just enjoyable. As it says in the song, it's lots of fun at Finnegans Wake. Okay, now on to a slight literature review, starting with Joseph Campbell's Skeleton Key. On page 3, he begins his introduction to a strange subject. Running riddle in fluid answer, Finnegans Wake is a mighty allegory of the fall and resurrection of mankind. It is a strange book, a compound of fable, symphony, and nightmare. A monstrous enigma beckoning imperiously from the shadowy pits of sleep. Its mechanics resemble those of a dream which has freed the author from the necessities of common logic and has enabled him to compress all periods of history, all phases of individual and racial development into a circular design of which every part is beginning, middle, and end. Finnegans Wake is a prodigious, multifaceted monomyth. So that's interesting. The idea of a multifaceted monomyth. This is, in a sense, a myth of an ever-changing, yet simultaneously unchanging order of history represented in, for example, Vico's cycle. And I think Joyce represented and understood that it was, in a sense, this approach to history, this ideal approach through people like Vico, and this will carry on into people like Hegel, for example, that it is an abstraction. It is universal only in a sense. It helps us understand ourselves, but it is not ourselves. We are not reducible to Finnegans Wake, but nevertheless we can learn from it. Remarking on the idea of Finn, who HCE is, he says, Finn typifies all heroes, Thor, Prometheus, Osiris, Christ, the Buddha, in whose life and through whose inspiration the race lives. It is by Finn's coming again, Finn again, in other words, by the reappearance of the hero, that strength and hope are provided for mankind. So there's this understanding of heroes as Hegel calls them, world historical persons. People who provide a break in history and the promise or possibility for some kind of resurrection or redemption. Indeed, Christ supposedly resurrected according to the biblical accounts. But with the understanding of this as a sort of vague, only somewhat perfect history, it is recognized that this world historical person, it's truly inside all of us. Here on page 185 and 186, Joyce says, till by its corrosive sublimation, one continuous present tense integument slowly unfolded all merry-voicing, mood-molded, cycle-wheeling history. Therefore, he said, reflecting from his own individual person life unlivable, transaccidentated through the slow fires of consciousness into a individual chaos, perilous, potent, common to all flesh, human only, mortal. But with each word that would not pass away, the squid self, which he had screened from the crystalline world, waned chagrin-old and Dorian grayer in its dodond. This exists that is its after having been said, we know. So there is a universal message coded within Finnegans Wake, right? There is a cycle-wheeling history reflected in individual persons in Finnegans Wake, which most significantly is a life unlivable, he says, right? This is a individual chaos which is perilous and potent and common to all human flesh, but not reduced to the characters which represent that struggle. Continuing with Campbell, he says Finnegans' fall from the ladder is hugely symbolic. It is Lucifer's fall, Adam's fall, the setting sun that will rise again, the fall of Rome, a Wall Street crash. It is Humpty Dumpty's fall and the fall of Newton's apple. It is the irrigating shower of spring rain that falls on seeded fields, and it is every man's daily recurring fall from grace. We might also add the falling of the walls of Jericho. He continues, these various fallings, implying as they do corresponding resurrections, cause a liberation of energy that keeps the universe turning like a water wheel, and provides the dynamic which sets in motion the four-part cycle of universal history. And that's important. So this cycle of history has a sort of binary motor which makes it work, which is the synchronous nature of falling and resurrection. Joyce tries to show us that every fall is not without its resurrection, and every resurrection, every rising to a height is not without its fall. This is a point that Nietzsche makes. He says, for example, you must have chaos within oneself to give birth to a dancing star. I tell you, you still have chaos in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So there's an appeal there to the lows within mankind that allow one to rise. And Nietzsche also talks about your goings under, your Untergehen, which is your path to going over. That you must go into the depths and the lows in order to understand your highs, and that you cannot have one without the other. So in this case, the fall is more important, but most specifically, and this is something that Campbell maybe sidestepped here or just didn't recognize, is that this liberation of energy that keeps the universe turning is specifically ALP. She is what actually does that, because HCE's energy is volatile. It is impotent, in fact, because, for example, HCE appears to have erectile dysfunction throughout Finnegans Wake. There are certain scenes of copulation where we are keyed into the fact that something is not quite right. They're sort of bumbling around in the dark, like Finnegans Wake, with a feeling of impotence. And when describing HCE in these scenes, we'll have words like goy, which is girl and boy mixed together, and other sort of almost like transgender ways to talk about Finnegan. But of course, it's not transgender. What's being shown here is his sort of loss of his masculinity by going into his depths, by realizing his complex nature, and most significantly, his dependence upon this female energy, which even allows for this. Campbell says, Earwicker himself is troubled by a passion, compounded of illicit and aspirational desires for his own daughter Isabel, whom he identifies with Tristram's Isolde, and who is the sweet little reincarnation of his wife. He continues, for in the last analysis, the universal judgment against HCE is but a reflection of his own obsessive guilt, and conversely, the sin which others condemn in him is but a conspicuous public example of the general, universal human original sin, privately effective within themselves. Thus, throughout the work, there is a continual intermelting of the accused and his accusers. That's important because, in a sense, all of the male characters are the same thing. They're all HCE, and HCE is all of them. All these characters moving around and against one another are but facets of some prodigious unity, and are at last profoundly identical, each as it were a figure in the dream complex of all others. And that's a sort of hint to the Jungian collective unconscious. Regarding ALP, he says, she is the eternal fructive and love-bearing principle in the world. A little crone who goes about gathering fragments into a basket. And that's a reference to the hen who lays her eggs in the first chapter, and also a reference to ALP as a lady out collecting all humanity's problems together into a basket. Right? A sort of comforting feeling. He continues again, she is a mother hen that scratches out of a dung heap the torn scrap of gossipacious letter filled with all the secrets of a woman's heart. This is the letter that ALP writes defending HCE. A bewitching letter which, only partially recovered, tantalizes with its life riddle through every page of Finnegans Wake. The entire book is, in fact, but a dreamlike emanation of this untitled Mama Festa memorializing the Mothergeist. Written, time and place unknown, by ALP herself. But above all, Anna is a river, always changing yet ever the same, the Heraclitean flux which bears all life on its current. She's the circular river of time flowing past Eve and Adam in the first sentence of the book, bearing in her flood the debris of dead civilizations and the seeds of crops and cultures yet to come. Now, there are also two male characters, which I didn't mention yet. Aside from HCE and ALP and Izzy, or Isabel, the daughter, there are two brothers, Shem and Sean, Jerry and Kevin. They have a bunch of different names, but Shem the penman, Sean the postman. These are the two different kinds. And Shem the penman is a semi-autobiographical portrayal of Joyce himself, and Sean, his brother Stanislaus. Campbell says, Shem, or Jerry, the introvert, rejected of men, is the explorer and discoverer of the forbidden. He is an embodiment of dangerous brooding, interned energy. He's the uncoverer of secret springs, and as such, the possessor of terrific lightning powers. The books he writes are so mortifying that they are spontaneously rejected by the descent. They threaten, they dissolve the protecting boundary lines of good and evil. And that's important. There's always, in Finnegans Wake, self-consciousness. Finnegans Wake is alive. In a very real sense, it is aware of itself. From the beginning, from the first chapter, you can find at least two passages that I'm thinking of off the top of my head where it is explicitly shown that Joyce is aware that this book is stylistically inventive, formally unique, linguistically complicated, and is able to comment on that, is able to tell us something about what this book is trying to do when it comes to, indeed, passing these boundaries. Under the title of Shem the penman, he's the seer, the poet, Joyce himself in his character of misunderstood, rejected artist. Right? Because Joyce chooses voluntary exile from Ireland because he's so displeased with the culture, the political ideas. His characteristic behavior is to take refuge in his own room, where on the foolscap of his own body he writes a phosphorescent book in a corrosive language which Sean cannot understand. Which that's very much autobiographical, because Stanislaus didn't like Finnegans Wake whatsoever. So there's a little bit from the Skeleton Key, just from the introduction, which is a nice read. I'm sure you can find a PDF online. If you're thinking of reading Finnegans Wake, read through that. It may prove itself useful. Next to Bill Cole-Cliatt's River Run to Livy. Now, in his analysis, he gives us lots of interesting things to consider about the first page and really uses it to expand on all the themes and characters in the book, also plot points. And throughout here, this is something I really like, is every chance he gets, he will link a word that he uses to its Wakeese version in Finnegans Wake. And there's a point where in chapter 10, which is on the 5th sentence, which begins the great fall of the off-wall. And regarding this fall, he writes, Bishop writes that the odd compound off-wall evokes the German Abfall, the Danish Norse Affald, the Dutch Avfall, and the English Offal, all generally meaning refuse or scraps. Joyce wrote of Dubliners that the odor of ashpits and old weeds and offal hangs around my stories. This all leads to the word dump, extracted from Humpty Dumpty, where the refuse of civilizations are let fall. Bill Colclaya also mentions that this may be a reference to the Tower of Babel, from which humanity kind of falls again after the fall, which we see on the first page of Finnegans Wake. By the way, we have the fall, and then we have that long thunder word, which I've done a recitation of the first page of Finnegans Wake. If you're interested, I'll leave it in the description. But he says, and while God's in the picture, the Latin fallere for to deceive and the German falle for trap or pitfall suggests, in concert with Joyce's contention, that humanity's fall was due to divine deception. And that's something very interesting to me because I'm an atheist. And when I read a book like this, Joyce makes so many Christian references, which, sometimes I'm like, does he really believe in the fall in this literal sense, or does he just like it as a metaphor? But there is a sense, of course, a very real sense in which, even from a Christian perspective, I think it is impossible to say anything other than that humans are predestined. And one of the issues, the problematics in the Wake that Joyce is worried about is predestination. The idea that some are preterite, that indeed maybe the entirety of humanity is preterite. And Joyce makes a continual suggestion on very chance passages that in fact we do not have free will. Specifically, that there's a sort of divine determinism per the theistic account of reality, which he's going to give us on varying places. For example, this is on page 409. Forgive me, Sean repeated from his liquid lips. Not would I want to do a strike of work, but it was condemned on me primitially by hierarch books and chief overseer cooks in their Eusebian concordat homilies. And there does be a power coming over me that is put upon me from on high, out of the book of breedings. And so, as it is becoming hereditary, I have, of course, nothing in view to look forward at, unless it is swan and beating the blind quarters out of my old fellow's orologium, olos olororium. A bad attack of maggot, it feels like. 'Tis trope, custodian said. Almost might I say of myself, while keeping out of crime, I am now becoming about fed up, be going circulating about them new Heikler's highways, like them nameless souls, erect and scorned and grizzled all over, till it's rusty October in this bleak forest, and was verbally compulsed by thinking of the crater of some noted volcano, or the Dublin River, or the Cachalot Troth subsidity, as a way out, or to isolate I from my multiple me's, on the spits of Lumbridge Island, or bury myself, clogs, cool cellar and all, deep in my wine upon pontine, unless Morrissey's cold could open me, or the gander may be at 49, as it is a tide fish, so it is. This pig's stomach business, and where on dearth, or in the miraculous metal of this expending omniverse, to turn since it came unto my hands, I am hopeless, of course, to be doing anything concerning. And there's a couple little images that we get in there. We have this condemned on me primitially, which is very interesting. This is predestination we get here. The idea of hierarch, that is hierarchy plus Noah's Ark. Again, there's a sort of divine hierarchy going on here. And then, of course, nothing in view to look forward to is of coerce. So, of course, plus coercion. Joyce is like, of course this is a state of coercion. So we are condemned and coerced to engage in conflict, for example, the likes of which we see between Shem the penman and Sean the postman, who are this eternal brotherly struggle. They're always disagreeing with each other, battling it out. Some very interesting passages in the Wake are about their struggles, but Joyce is saying that this is something we've been condemned to do, and that he's becoming fed up by being circulating about them new Heikler's highways. Right? It's like we're being bustled along a preordained highway, which is, in a very real sense, a delineated path which one must take. And an attempt to here isolate I from my multiple me's is just an interesting thing. But he continues, how it was forestalled for me by brevet for my vacation in life while possessing stout legs to be disbarred after holy orders from unnecessary servile work of reckless walking of all sorts, for the relics of my time, for otherwise by my so douching I would get into a blame, their receives fall out. Excelsior tips the best. Week stop work, stop walk, stop woke. Go thou this island, one house sleep there, then go thou other island, 2 house sleep there, then catch one night maze, then home to dearies. Never back a woman you defend, never get quit of a friend on whom you depend, never make face to a foe till he's rife, and never get stuck to another man's fife. Amen. Ptah. His hungry will be done, on the continent as in Ironesia. But believe me in my simplicity, I am awful good, I believe, so I am, at the root of me, praise be right cheek discipline. And I can now truthfully declare it before my gaiety's panto creator, with my flesh-pettered palms on the epistles of the apostles, that I do my reasonable's best to recite my grocery beans for mummy, mit dummy, mot mother, mot bunzer, regular, genuflections enclosed. Gosh, it's a lovely, lovely passage. One of my favorites in the entirety of the work. So forestalled, it is foretold, also maybe foresold, as in we are sold to this fate that we have no control over. My vacation in life, right? So in the theistic conception, life is kind of like a temporary vacation before you get to your eternal fate. And then unnecessary servile work of reckless walking of all sorts. Right? So it's like we're condemned to toil here in this temporary vacation. And then he talks about going to these different islands. Go thou this island, 1 house sleep there, then go thou other island. He refers to Ireland as an archipelago at many points, which is very interesting. It's as if it's these isolated people who can't seem to understand each other, just like islands can't understand each other in a sense. Yet we can collate them into what we would consider an archipelago, such that it is now a group of individuals which have some sort of confluence together. So in this sense, right, humans are just one human among others, which are collated together and become humankind, but are all predestined to fall to the same fate, in a sense. His hungry will be done is very interesting, right? He desires, sure, communion, but he also desires worship. Think of the first commandment in the 10 Commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. First off, there's an admission that there are other gods, but he also says during the flood that he is a jealous God. Right? So there is this sense of jealousy, of hunger to almost see suffering from God. Cheek discipline, right? This is like corporal punishment, almost like being slapped across the cheek which is very interesting. And then there's this Gaieties Pantocreator. Now the Greek gay means earth. And then Pantocreator is from the Greek and Latin panto, which means creator, all begetter, all creator. The Pantocrator in Greek is almighty. And then we've also got a reference, of course, to the epistles and the apostles. And yet he does his very best when given this very less than ideal situation, per se. And there are a couple other references just to narrow down this point, because it's something that's actually talked about quite a bit, and I want to give some more references to it. On page 516, he kept forecursing. Right? So there we've got an idea that we've been cursed in advance. Also on page 518, the illegal-looking range offender, alias turfing iron, a product of Hostages & Co. engineers. So HCE is here, Hostage & Co. engineers. But we are also, it's as if he's saying that HCE himself is a product of God as hostage, the divine will as hostage. And this is funny because just a few lines before that, we have the word kismet, which in Islam is the will of Allah, which is fate or destiny, right? So there's this sense of divine determinism, of a farce, of chaos we are beholden to, which, interestingly, because we are a hostage, we're a product of Hostages & Co. engineers, a product of HCE, maybe it's a sense of this is something we put on ourselves. As humans who have created religions, we put this pressure, this guilt on ourselves, and then we have to try to get beyond it, which is very interesting. On page 523, we get another passage where God has basically sinned against man by predestining them to fall. Have you ever reflected, Wepotel, that the evil, what though it was willed, might nevertheless lead somehow unto good toward the genuality? Apropos of Haster meets Waster, in talking of plebiscites by a show of hands, whether declaratory or offensive, in all seriousness, has it become to dawn in you yet that the dependent, the man from St. Eve, may have been, one is reluctant to use the passive voice, may be been, as such, sinned against, as sinning. For if we look at it verbally, perhaps there is no true noun in active nature, where every body being, please read this mufto, is becoming in its own town eyeballs, not the long form and the strong form and reform altogether. So, right, there's a sense in which one has been sinned against as much as sinning for original sin, which, no individual person was responsible for this, even in the Christian paradigm, except for Adam and Eve. On page 556, we have the word cursor bog. Bog in Russian is God. God is a cursor, according to this definition. So once again, just one of these little hints. Finally, on page 563, we have a final instance where it's stated pretty clearly. Weeping shouldst not thou be when man falls, but that divine scheming ever adoring be. So you be either man or mouse, and you be neither fish nor flesh. Take and take. There's an interesting reference, if you're curious, on page 273, where he says, shake eternity and lick creation, in one of his footnotes, which is just such a cool quote. Really hinting at this ability of, yes, I do need to take up my sword, take up my cross, perhaps, and realize that there is, even in the Christian paradigm, divine scheming going on here. And in the face of this, divine spite, one must act nonetheless. Now, of course, one of the interesting aspects of Finnegans Wake, and I must remember that we are still in the literature review. I'm just getting back to it because I get so sidetracked just delving into Finnegans Wake, getting lost in the wake of the River Liffey that is the Wake. But it's cyclical, right? It starts with a sentence which is not capitalized because it's the middle of the last sentence of the book. It begins with river run, indented, lowercase r, and it ends with the, with no period. Bill Cole-Cliott says, beginning with an address to the Reverend, river run, and ending with the root for God, the, Welsh, or Theo in Greek, makes the wake cyclical in still another way. So we are sort of beginning and ending with God, with thoughts and concerns about God. He continues much later. The name Livy leads to Vico, who, in developing his cyclical theory, placed a great deal of importance on the writings of the famous Roman historian Livy. Long Livius Lane and New Livius Lane. Those are both from Finnegans Wake. Another Roman reference comes from Joyce's birth registration mentioned earlier, where his middle name of Augustine was incorrectly written as Augusta, connecting him to Livia, the wife of Caesar Augustus. Skrabaniec mentions that Augusta was an honorary title of Livia, a suitable name for the author of River Run. Right? So there's all these almost biographical aspects within here. He says, Joyce shattered the categories of time and space, writes C.P. Curran, and sought by the incantation of sound and otherwise enormously to extend the sensitiveness of our apprehension. Christopher Sawyer Lautiano adds, oral speech exists in time, written speech exists in space. It is this dual property of language which is underscored here, where the spoken code of language is joined to the visual code of perception. The visual code creates the thing. The spoken code elaborates and illuminates it. Joyce may have been following the desire expressed by Gustave Flaubert in a letter, quote, what I should like to write is a book about nothing, a book dependent on nothing external, which would be held together by the strength of its style. What Flaubert desired, Joyce did. No one has described Finnegans Wake any better. Indeed, I agree. Because, in a sense, it's contingent upon everything. It's contingent upon all of human history and the understanding all the illusions that Joyce has. But, in a sense, Finnegans Wake could possibly be understood just by listening to it. Sometimes I just like to put on the audiobook of Finnegans Wake, and I don't know the context of the passage that I'm listening to, but I just know I like it. And that is a unique literary experience that is hard to find. Burgess writes that Finnegans Wake is as close to a work of nature as any artist ever got. Massive, baffling, serving nothing but itself, suggesting a meaning but never quite yielding anything but a fraction of it, and yet, like a tree, desperately simple. I love that. It is very simple, in a sense. Joyce is concerned with language. The book is about language. It is language linguizing itself, so to speak. I know that's not a verb, but I just made it up. And it does have the sort of cosmic scope of the universe when it comes to, aspects of physics and history and human nature and, the divine and things like this. Yet it is a prodigiously simple book at the same time. Bill Cole-Cliott continues, to readers who complain that the questions raised by Finnegans Wake are too difficult, impossible to answer satisfactorily, that it's not worth the time and energy to unravel its mysteries, I say, get over it. If physicists said the same things about our universe, they could justifiably mothball their particle accelerators, put the lens caps over their telescopes, forget their mathematical formulas, and watch television sitcoms and game shows instead of quarks and stars. But humans aren't made that way. Our collective brain power can solve great puzzles. The challenge Saint Beuve presents is that each one of us, at every instant, should be occupied in breaking in his mind the mold about to stiffen and take shape. Let us not congeal. To this, Andre Gide adds, this image explains wonderfully the poetic effort and work of Joyce, his justification for being, and under his fantastic, futile guise, his worthy contribution. Franz Kafka writes that a book must be the axe for the frozen sea inside us. Finnegans Wake can be that book as it offers an invitation to come. Step out of your shell. That's very true. He says, Finnegans Wake is to books as Mount Everest is to mountains. Both are generally appreciated from a distance, but there are a few brave souls who have to tackle one or the other simply because it's there. I think of the famous quote, someone who was asked why they climbed Mount Everest, and they were like, because it's there. Richard M. Cain writes that the Wake has its own unique, compelling force that offers an original and significant worldview, a multi-dimensional perspective. There it stands, an Everest of literature, a constant challenge to the courageous and the foolhardy. But never think an exhaustive expedition must be mounted in attempting to scale the summit to gain its grand view. A pleasant ramble in the foothills of Mount Finnegan affords pleasurable panoramas as well. Very good book, and very true. It doesn't take a lot to enjoy Finnegans Wake, and you can enjoy it on so many levels. That's why I think it's actually a lot more inviting than we would like to believe. Okay, so with the literature review in mind, what did I think about Finnegans Wake, honestly, after reading it? I'm pleased. It is an experience, plain and simple. It's something that requires, as I said, your full attention, and it is a reworking of the novel that I'm glad there's nothing quite like it. There are other things, I'm thinking maybe like Tristram Shandy, or some works of Rabelais, or some other kind of postmodern stuff that might be similar, but nothing is exactly quite like Finnegans Wake. And because of that, it is a unique experience that I will be glad. I mean, when I just look at the cover of this book, it seethes with potential and the memories I've had reading it. It took me just under, 3 weeks to read, I think. I started it on my 20th birthday and just finished it, I guess, this morning at 12:20 a.m. Had like 35 pages left, the recurso, and I read it in 3 hours and 20 minutes, which is fast for me because I'm an extremely slow reader. But I just became enraptured by this book. It is something that I would encourage you to dive into. Maybe when I was looking forward to it, for about a month before I read it, I just dived into every single thing on YouTube of this book. If there is something on Finnegans Wake on YouTube, I have seen it, and I've probably seen it multiple times. So maybe some of the stuff that I'm saying is regurgitated, something you've already heard, but you just gotta know everything about it. You gotta just be enraptured by it. And my thoughts about this book is, Anthony Burgess said that it is the funniest book of literature, I think, something akin to that. I don't think that's true. There were a few moments where I chuckled, but not because it was funny in like the slapstick way where a lot of the puns are kind of like slapstick humor. There are some passages that sounded so good that I would just start cackling maniacally out loud. it brings a smile to my face just thinking about those different passages, and especially these ones in red towards the end of the third part. I was just like, man, that is so freaking awesome. And I will say, out of the 4 parts of the Wake, the second part was the most dirging. I was just trying to get through the second part. There wasn't as much going on. When you look at my flags, you can see that the middle has seen a bit less flagging than the others, just because it wasn't as compelling. That very stylistically inventive part in the second part, around page 280 again, with all the footnotes, very interesting. I actually ended up enjoying it more than I thought I would by the time I finished. But I really just enjoy having completed it and knowing that I can sort of put this pin, yes, on my literary accomplishments, but also I had a very profound realization about literature in general when reading Finnegans Wake, which is that literature is one of the few individual experiences we have left. Yes, literature is about learning about other people, learning about the author, learning about the characters and all that. But as Joyce says in Ulysses, every day we walk through ourselves. Time and time again, we come back to ourselves. So everything that we see, we reflect on it as it relates to ourselves. And there is a sort of push and pull that can occur where that content can pull you out of yourself, make you something new. You know, a sort of anti-idealist understanding of what art is. That it is not just reduced to your self-image, but it is intimately tied to yourself. And Finnegans Wake is an individual reading experience. Is it beneficial to read with others? See what people like McHugh and Bill Cole Cliatt and Joseph Campbell and real people living in a reading group are saying? Yes, it's important. But I don't think I would have enjoyed Finnegans Wake as much if it was a collective, slow reading project, because oftentimes I found my reading speed ebbing and flowing according to the ebbing and flowing tides of this work, of ALP herself. As I was approaching the end of Finnegans Wake and you get to that last monologue of ALP, I was just, I was back to reading really, really fast. I was just enjoying it. And I feel like a group may have held me back, and I don't mean that to sound narcissistic. And now I would like to read it with a group, but I'm glad that I did it on my own. And I say that to say, reading Finnegans Wake on your own shouldn't feel daunting. It should actually feel inviting. It is an opportunity and an exercise in individual interpretation, the likes of which I've never read before. So, in terms of aesthetic value, Finnegans Wake is a 10 out of 10, 11 out of 10. In terms of form, probably a 9 out of 10. There are some moments where the form maybe kind of wasn't perfect. Maybe I was getting lost in it a little bit. Joyce understood the importance of form a lot. There are 4 cycles for Vico. There's 4 chapters. There's 4 gospels. There's the 4 apostles, or what, there's important stuff regarding form, but sometimes I felt like I was getting lost in it. In terms of just pure linguistic value, there is no other book like this. One thing I will say that I feel semi-strongly about is that this is not a traditional reading experience, like I've said, and because of that, it is not plot-focused, in my opinion. The plot is important. The plot helps us understand what Joyce is saying, and without understanding the plot, you wouldn't understand the language, of course. But there is a certain amount of enjoyment that I get from just the sonorous nature of the work. And I think that is something that's hard to find. It's easy to find a good story, but it's hard to find it said in an obscure way, because I can't remember who said that only geniuses can achieve the task of being obscure. Right? Because if something is obscure, there's something there, but you have to see through the opacity to get to it. If you're just dumb, it's just bullshit. Finnegans Wake is not bullshit. It is enticing, exciting, unique, and splendid. For this 6th section, I'd like to give some reading tips and some annotation tips. Really, these are 2 strokes of the same 2-stroke engine. You cannot read Finnegans Wake without annotating it. Because what does annotation do? When you sit with a pen in your hands, ready to click, I'm constantly clicking my pen because I just see a word, click, unclick. See another word, click, unclick. When you get in that mentality, you start to approach the text in a critical manner, unlike you would if you were just skimming past it, just trying to get through pages. Which sometimes it's going to be like that when you're reading Finnegans Wake. But at the same time, you must come to it as an annotator, because it means that you appreciate the text enough to devote your ink, your money in a real sense, to it. Your extra time. You are willing to give it the benefit of the doubt and notate all of these things so that you can go back to them. That is really why I annotate books. Sure, it's helpful as I'm reading along sometimes. In reality, for Finnegans Wake, it probably breaks up the flow, actually. But every single page I go back to in Finnegans Wake, I can remember something about when I made that annotation. Possibly because it was such a short time ago that I was reading it. But that speaks something to the ability to turn each basically undifferentiated page. You know, when you look at a blank page of Finnegans Wake, it's really hard to be like, oh yeah, I remember that exact page, unless you see some word or passage you remember really well. But when it's annotated, it is fully your own, which is an experience in reading that I think is worth it in and of itself. But it also helps you compartmentalize the text as a whole. Helps you reference it. You know, when I'm doing lectures on Finnegans Wake, I would be dead with a blank copy of Finnegans Wake. But this is wholly navigable for me. And with regards to navigation, one thing that I recommend you do, which I've done here, as you can see on the table of contents page and beyond, is I have a bunch of references to things that I wanted to go back to. And this continues on the next page as well. But this is all sorts of, here's a passage that says Finnegans Wake is a dream. Here's some stuff about HCE's crime, the link between HCE and the phallus and the fall. References to language from the first page that comes back over and over. And that's something really interesting that you may not notice, is there is a lot of recurring language in Finnegans Wake that is often bypassed if you're not able to annotate your text thoroughly. For example, here on page 213, this is the very last section of part 1, and this is in the one that you can look up on YouTube, Joyce reciting it himself, which is really nice.
In time, there's the bell for sexualitis, a concepta descendus praise, time.
But we see that on other pages mirrored in different ways. For example, on page 379, bing bong saxoloter for congesters or soliders pray. Right? So that's another instance where we do hear something akin to that first passage. It has the same rhythm. That's an important thing. It has a cadence and a rhythm, which makes it what it is. Here's another one. Ding dong, where's your pal in silks a luster? Right, so we've got that same ding dong, bing bong, ping pong little effect going on there. So there's stuff like that. This whole passage where Joyce does all this stuff, there's another one. Throw your cobwebs from your eyes, woman, and spread your washing proper. That gets repeated over and over and over again. So when you're reading, look for repeating passages like that, and you will start to see these sort of intermeshing nature of Finnegans Wake, and it will help you appreciate it. And when you annotate that, as you go back, you will be able to understand what you actually read. And then another thing, all the cross-linguistic puns, depending on your familiarity with other languages, I'm most familiar with German, not a native or fluent speaker by any means, but I know enough to be familiar with the cadence of German speech and some of the sounds of the words, such that I can recognize some of the things, and I also just have a dictionary that I can look things up in for meanings and things like that. Notate all of those. For example, if there's a German word, I will put G, colon, and then I'll put the meaning of the word, if it's spelled exactly as the German word is in the page. If it's spelled slightly differently, I will put G, I'll put the actual spelling of the German word, colon, and then put the meaning. Do this for all of the words you see. You'll also have references to various characters. A common one is Shem, Ham, and Japheth. We have Chinted, Chintam, Chintid, Taphid. So, Ted, Tam, and Taphid. Shem, Ham, and Japheth. You've also got Tom, Dick, and Harry. You'll see that all over. So there are these repeating themes that when you see them, just annotate them. If there's a word that is spelled somewhat similar to a word put it off in the margin. And also, feel free to just underline every single HCE or ECH, every single ALP or PLA, all of those. Underline those initials. Even maybe write HCE or the triangle sigla for ALP next to it, so that you can just see on the page. That will tell you what the subject of this sentence is. Is it HCE? Is it Shem? Is it Sean? Is it Izzy? Is it ALP? Oftentimes it's not going to be explicitly said, but you can figure it out by context based off of whether or not HCE is there. And also on the lines in between the words, you can write the equivalent of, I don't know, like the apostles example from one of the earlier things that I mentioned. You can just put right on top of the word apostles in really tiny lettering. And that's why it's important to have this bigger edition where you've got more space in between the words to put all that. Because some of my pages, I'll give you a little scroll through of my book here. They are so densely packed with annotations. And you can see that it kind of wavers. What I decided to do is I have a black pen for most of my writing and underlining of things that's kind of important. And if it's a little bit more important, I will put a sideways V next to my passage. It just kind of is a little semi-arrow, which hints to me that the passage is important. And then I have red if it's a little bit more important. And then I have green for extra important. And generally I stick to underlining. I have a video where I go into my annotations in more detail, just my practices in general. But sometimes I will circle or box something that is important. For Finnegans Wake, especially terms like, for example, the ones regarding predestination and being cursed by God, a lot of those I had circled or squared just because it's helpful to do so. It's easy on the eye. And I just try to fill up the pages as much as I can. Oftentimes I have to squiggle little arrows through different parts of the text to be able to get to where you can see, where this annotation is leading to and where this translation is leading to. So all of that kind of comes together to help make the Wake more enjoyable, especially as a reader after the fact. I can go back and be like, man, this is so cool that I did all this. I just enjoyed reading, and I made it my own book. So hopefully that helps make some sense of some of the annotation practices that I used and some of the reading tips that can help enjoy Finnegans Wake more. Seventh and lastly, why read Finnegans Wake? Well, I first want to say that, like I've said before, this book is not for everyone. Some people will enjoy it a lot and some people will hate it. There's all sorts of differing views, and I don't think you need to be snobby if you like it. I can certainly see why many would not like it, and it is not my favorite work of literature. When it comes to the pure sounds of language, this is my favorite work of literature. But of course, that's not everything about literature that makes it enjoyable. There is certain things about plot and semantics that, for example, I see more in Ulysses than I do in Finnegans Wake. So I can understand why someone who loves Ulysses would hate Finnegans Wake. I can also understand why someone may love Finnegans Wake and feel ambivalent to something like Portrait of the Artist or Ulysses. Because it's just a whole nother universe. It's a whole nother linguistic project which you should experience. That's why you should read this, because it is an experience that you'll be glad you had by the time you're finished. And it's not a hard book to finish. I know one guy, it took him like a year to read it, and the book flip-through idea was from him. It obviously didn't take me a year, and maybe you might think that I didn't read it well because I finished it so fast. I devoted every waking hour of my day. I was reading 9, 10, 11 hours a day, which is a lot for me. Usually my eyes go out by that time, and they certainly were on this last day. I was like barely able to see anything. My eyes were getting all blurry. But I was devoting a lot of time to this, and you might find that you do that. You might just do just a few, 5 pages a day. That's probably enough for some people. And it'll take a while to get through Finnegans Wake, but the nice thing also with Finnegans Wake is you don't always need a lot of context to enjoy it. So it's something you can kind of just pick up, and a lot of people just like to leaf through Finnegans Wake, just look for the little passages. They won't do a full read-through of Finnegans Wake. When you ask, have you read Finnegans Wake, they'll say, you know, I've touched ALP's soliloquy at the very end. I've touched the first chapter. I've touched the first page. That's only having a very superficial relationship to Finnegans Wake. Once you wade through the wake that is the waters of Finnegans Wake, you'll see why it's enjoyable, I think. You don't have to like it, but you will see why it is enjoyable. And I think at least being able to understand that will help make this book less obscure and not so stingy. Some people are so stingy about Finnegans Wake. This book genuinely is not for everyone. I think it's valid to hate this book, and I also think it's valid to love it. And I think there's something enjoyable about that paradox. So that being said, that brings us to the end of this very lengthy video. I hope this has been helpful for thinking about Finnegans Wake and maybe convincing you to read it. Check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. Become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you'd like to donate to the channel, because all of these books are not cheap at all, especially for Finnegans Wake. That's it for this lecture, and I'll see you